Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to our webinar presentation today entitled Mining Disclosure Essentials, Keep Calm and Avoid the Ditch. This is the 5th year of the OSC's Small and Medium Enterprise Series, the SME series, a presentation to support SMEs in Ontario. This is also the 5th year that a presentation on mining disclosure has been part of this series, but the first time that we'll be running the series as a webinar-only presentation that will be posted on the OSC website. With this in mind, please note that participants will be sent an evaluation form after the presentation. We would appreciate if you could take a few moments of your time and complete the form and let us know if you like the new format. This year, as in every year, we try to do things a bit different. And the webinar presentation is designed to provide mining issuers with the essential rules of the road to help the public reporting and keeping it on track and in compliance with the requirements of NI 43-101, Standards of Disclosure for Mineral Projects, and NI 51-102, Continuous Disclosure Obligations, in particular MD&A reporting. Today's presenters are myself, Craig Waldy, Senior Geologist with the Corporate Finance Branch of the OSC, Jim White, my colleague, who is another Senior Geologist in the Corporate Finance Branch, and Ray Ho, another colleague who is an accountant in the Corporate Finance Branch. Our goal is at the end of the presentation, you'll have a better understanding of mining disclosure requirements and MD&A requirements. First, a word of caution. We try very hard to get the information in our presentations to be correct, but I'll need to remind you of a few things. First, the views expressed are our own views and not necessarily the views of the Commission or other Commission staff. The information does not constitute legal advice and has been summarized for presentation purposes, and you need to look at the official documents for the full requirements. Also, information reflects laws and also relevant standards that are in effect at the time or the date of the presentation. As a reminder, it's the responsibility of the issuer to comply with securities requirements. Here's a presentation of today's outline. There'll be 7 main sections. I'll start off with opening remarks about the SME Institute, some fundamental concepts of NI 43-101, and then I'll start off with the first part related to disclosure requirements through the various stages of development of a mineral project from exploration to production. Jim will carry on with the second part of disclosure for the various stages of development, and then talk about website disclosure hazards and a section on technical reports with some of the basics and some of the common pitfalls. Finally, Ray will cover the MD&A disclosure requirements related to mining issuers and venture issuer regulation changes that came into effect in 2015. At the end of the session, we'll run a Q&A session. Look at the objective of the SME Institute. It's basically to support SMEs in facilitating cost-effective compliance through issuer outreach and education. It's important that issuers know the requirements to help them navigate the regulatory waters so they don't run aground. The idea is that if we can help issuers better understand the disclosure requirements, they can focus their limited resources on their core business activity, which is building their company. Ultimately, we both have the same goal, for issuers to provide appropriate and meaningful information to investors. It's important to remember that at the end of the day, investor confidence in the information that companies provide is critical to the success of the company. The first section, we'll look at the fundamental concepts of NI 43-101. And you may have 2 initial questions related to this. 1, what is 43-101? And 2, why do we need mining disclosure rules? First question, what is 43-101? National Instrument 43-101, Standards of Disclosure for Mineral Projects, is a rule that governs how issuers disclose scientific and technical information about mineral projects to the public. Back in 2001, securities commissions through the Canadian Securities Administrators implemented National Instrument 43101 in response to the Bre-X scandal, which occurred in 1997. Then there were minor revisions in 2005, and the most recent version of NI 43101 came into force in 2011. Second question, why do we need mining disclosure rules? The key answer is investor confidence. Mining is a risky business, and chances of finding and developing a profitable mine is very low. This requires access to large amounts of risk capital over a long period of time, and projects could fail at any stage, wiping out millions of dollars of investor equity. Therefore, investors and issuers must maintain investor confidence in order to move their projects forward. If we look at provincial oversight of Canada's approximately 1,315 mine issuers that are listed on the TSX Venture, the NEX, and the CSE. Now, Canada does not have a national regulator, so oversight of mine issuers is based on the location of the issuer's head office. So you can see about 64% of mine issuers are based in BC, 26 in Ontario, 6% based in Quebec, 4% based in Alberta, and less than 1% in the other provinces. Because of the number of mine issuers that we have oversight on, there are approximately 12 technical staff at the various regulatory agencies. The commissions, the BC, Ontario, and Quebec commissions have 7. The exchanges and IROC, the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada, has 5. And as an aside, the Alberta Securities Commission has 4 oil and gas technical reviewers. If we look at the core principles or the core pillars of National Instrument 43101, number 1 is really the QP, which is the foundation of National Instrument 43101 and the real gatekeeper concept of the whole rule, in that all public reporting of technical information must be prepared or approved by a qualified person. Then there's the standards and best practices developed by the industry. In this case, it's CIM, Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy, and Petroleum. There's the standards, which are the CIM definition standards for such things as resources, reserves, pre-feasibility study, feasibility study, things like that. And then the best practices, which are CIM best practice guidelines, which have been developed for exploration, for estimating resources and reserves, and also looking at guidance on commodity pricing. And the third is the technical report, which is the publicly filed report prepared in accordance with a prescribed form and signed off by the qualified person, which may need to be independent of the issuer in some instances. The report is filed on CDAR, which is a system of electronic document analysis and retrieval. And at the end, when you look at the sort of the overall arching concept, is the objective of 43101 is to ensure that disclosure is based on reliable information, reflecting professional opinions, based on industry best practices, and using standardized industry terms. 43101 you can think of having 3 main components, or 3 parts. The first 2 are law. That's the national instrument itself, which sets out disclosure rules and requirements. It incorporates directly by reference the CIM definition standards for mineral resources and mineral reserves, which was last updated in May 2014. And the other part of the law is the Form 43101F1 for technical reports. This has a prescribed table of contents and disclosure requirements for technical reports. The third part is the policy, Companion Policy 43101CP, which is the guidance and interpretation part of National Instrument 43101. And it references the CIM best practices, the guidelines related to best practices that the QP should follow. Speaking about the QP, you can think of the QP being sort of the 3 E's of a qualified person. Again, the qualified person plays a key gatekeeper role in 43101. The first 2 The education and ethics component are really yes/no answers. So education, you need to have a university degree in geoscience or engineering related to mining. And ethics, you need to be a member of a professional association that's referred to in NI 43-101. The third is the self-test. This is the experience, or more specifically, the relevant experience. And we'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. The fourth E, which is not on this slide, relates to expertise, specifically expertise with the requirements and obligations of NI 43-101. Professional competence in itself does not imply NI 43-101 disclosure competence. It requires an additional skill set, including a high level of proficiency and understanding with the CIM definition standards, CIM best practice guidelines, the national instrument itself, and staff notices which we put out from time to time. Related to relevant experience, this is really the QP self-test component of a qualified person. The CIM definition standards provide some guidance for QPs to consider, and the QP needs to be comfortable defending their opinions, findings in front of their peers in order to demonstrate competence and relevant experience in the commodity, the type of deposit, and particular situation under consideration. This is very similar to the concept of a competent person in Australia, South Africa, and other mining jurisdictions. Just as an aside, Jim and I wrote an article in CIM magazine related to relevant experience back in June 2012. There are a number of misconceptions related to National Instrument 43-101, basically what it is and what it is not. First, what 43-101 is meant to be. It's meant to be a disclosure rule. It sets standards how issuers disclose information to the public. And that disclosure must be signed off by a qualified person who takes responsibility for the information. The information must be based on reasonable assumptions which are clearly explained, must use terms and definitions in a consistent manner. The disclosure needs to be unbiased and identify potential risks and uncertainties with the mineral project. It must be balanced and not misleading, providing good news as well as bad news, and written in a form that's plain language and understandable to a reasonably informed investor. Secondly, what 43-101 is not, it is not a guarantee of good work. It places the obligation on the issuer to have work done by a qualified person, and the qualified person is supposed to do it correctly as a professional. It's not a cookbook for mineral estimation. It sets rules for disclosure standards, not estimation practices. It's designed so others can review and judge a qualified person's work through public reporting. And it's not a vetting process at the regulatory agency in that we don't approve disclosure. Just because a technical report is filed doesn't mean it's compliant. It's up to the reporting issuer to comply with the requirements. This is a graphical representation or general representation of the process starting from data collection to public disclosure. So we start at the top and work our way down through the reducing funnels. We start with sort of the cloud of data collection at the top. So that's the sampling, rock sampling, soil sampling, geophysics, drilling, assay results, all in the blue box on the right-hand side. That goes into the data analysis and evaluation funnel, sort of where you're compiling and understanding the data. Out of that, you'll have internal reports prepared as memos for management, through maps, such things that are all for internal documents. Then comes down to the question of material information. And the question you need to look at is the information material or significant that's expected to have an effect on the value of the company's shares? This is a company by company determination. But if it is material, then it comes out as public disclosure by way of a timely news release or other disclosure such as an MD&A, technical report, websites, social media. That's the red box on the right-hand side. So we look at the involvement of the QP. On the left-hand side, the QP is really involved in the whole process, from data collection to public disclosure. It doesn't mean that QP has to collect the data, but they need to be involved in the process. On the right-hand side, there's the CIM best practice guidelines or other similar guidance and best practices related to collecting and interpreting data. At the very end of the process, you have 43-101, which is the public disclosure component. So only 43-101 itself only comes out as the public disclosure requirements part of the whole process. Look at the next section, which is NI 43-101 disclosure through the various stages of development of a mineral project from exploration to production. So here's the framework that we'll be using to talk about disclosure requirements. There's the x-axis, which is increasing time, the y-axis, which is increasing project value, moving along five development stages. So we'll start off with exploration, mineral resource, preliminary economic assessment, mineral reserves, which are based on a pre-feasibility study, and production. The stars, they represent technical report triggers based on first-time disclosure of 3 of the main milestones that we'll talk about later. That's the mineral resource, PEA, preliminary economic assessment, and mineral reserves. So we'll start off with exploration disclosure. Exploration disclosure can really be broken down into 2 areas, the first being surface sampling, the second being drilling. So we'll talk about the surface sampling first. The requirements are listed here in 3.3 and 3.2 of 43-101. You need to provide the type and location of samples, any significant results, and the quality control program that's been used. You need to talk about the lab information related to the assay method used, the lab name in relationship to the company, if any, and data verification, confirming that the data has been properly generated, accurately transcribed, and is suitable for the purpose the data is being used. If we look at the disclosure related to drilling results, we need to talk about the type of drilling, the location of the drill holes, their azimuth and dip, or direction and angle of the holes, assays, significant assays and their depth, any high-grade sections within lower-grade intervals, true width information, if the true width is known, state whether it's known or not, and quality control program that's used. Then, like the surface sampling, also information related to the lab and information related to data verification. Some disclosure pitfalls related to exploration and drill information would be lack of the drill hole location, azimuth and dip information, missing information about true widths, no quality control information provided, missing the name of the lab, or using overly promotional statements to describe the results of the drilling or surface sampling, such as the world-class intersections, bonanza grades, spectacular information, spectacular discovery, things like that. Next, we'll look at historical estimates, and that's a defined term in National Instrument 43-101. It's basically an estimate prepared before the issuer acquired the property. And it's an estimate that has not been verified by a QP as a current estimate. The historical estimate can be disclosed without triggering a technical report, but that disclosure must follow certain requirements, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So the disclosure requirements for historical estimates are from section 2.4 of NI 43-101. You need to use the original terms, the source and date of the estimate, any key assumptions related to the estimate if they're known, whether or not CIM categories were used, and also talk a little bit about what needs to be done to upgrade the estimate to a current estimate. One of the key requirements is the cautionary language that needs to be provided if you're disclosing a historical estimate, such that the QP has not done sufficient work to classify the estimate as current, and the company is not treating it as current. Some disclosure pitfalls related to historical estimates include missing the information about the source and date of the estimate, and missing the cautionary language, or sometimes we've seen people use historical estimates in an economic analysis, which is prohibited. Next, we'll look at the expiration target. Now, it's not a defined term in 43-101, but it relates to a statement of the expiration potential reported as a range of tons in grade before a mineral resource estimate has been estimated. The target needs to have a justifiable basis that's described and supported, and the target must be something that can be tested with further exploration. So it's not just an aspirational target. Disclosing an exploration target requires information that's laid out in section 2.32 of 43-101. You need to provide a range of tons in grade, such as 10 to 15 million tons at 1 to 2 grams per ton gold, something like that. Provide a basis for the target ranges and include specific cautionary language that is conceptual in nature, insufficient information is available to determine a resource, and it's uncertain if a resource will be determined with further work. Some of the pitfalls related to exploration targets is not providing a range of tons in grade, and missing cautionary language, or again, if the exploration target is used in economic analysis, that's prohibited under 43-101. Look at the next stage, which is mineral resource estimate disclosure, and in this case you'll see for the first time we have a star, and that the first time reporting of a mineral resource estimate will trigger a technical report. So a mineral resource estimate is defined in CIM, which is incorporated by reference into 43-101. The key concept here is the second bullet point in the list, which is the mineral resource needs to have reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction. And that's really a judgment call by the qualified person that needs to consider the technical and economic factors that go into choosing a reasonable cutoff grade, such as metal price, mining method, metallurgical recoveries, and any costs associated with mining and processing. So as an example from what we see sometimes in technical reports related to reasonable prospects assumptions. Now we see variation in judgment by a QP as to how they determine reasonable prospects. But what we see from most firms is something like the following example from an open pit estimate, which is going to be based on a series of technical and economic parameters, such as the gold and silver price that's assumed, gold and silver recoveries, the exchange rate, depending on what country you're in, and assumed costs for mining, processing, and G&A. That's more typical of what we see for some tech reports that provide a good explanation or a good overview of how reasonable prospects were determined. We're looking at disclosure of mineral resource estimate. This is laid out in section 2.2 and 3.4 of 43-101. In that you need to use the CIM categories for resources. That's the inferred resource, indicated resource, or measured resource. You need to provide the quantity and grade for each resource category. Inferred resources must always be reported separately from other categories. And if contained metal is disclosed, such as 1 million ounces of gold, then you need to provide the tons and grade for each category that makes up that contained metal. You need to include the effective date of the resource estimate, provide the key assumptions, parameters, and methods that were used to determine the estimate, and discuss, if known, any risks that may materially affect the resource estimate. As well, if an economic analysis of resources is disclosed, such as in a PEA, then the statement must be provided that says mineral resources that are not mineral reserves do not have demonstrated economic viability. If we look at some of the disclosure pitfalls related to reporting of mineral resources, sometimes we see there's no cutoff grade provided, nothing related to the key assumptions used, no effective date, adding inferred resources to other categories, having an unconstrained resource estimate, such as like just a mineral inventory, not following the Salient best practice guidelines for certain estimates of certain types of commodities, such as potash or uranium, and accidentally disclosing, say, a PEA, which could trigger a technical report to be filed. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim, who will carry on with PEAs.
Thanks, Craig. PEAs are very often the first step beyond a mineral resource. It's the kind of thing that a junior company will do as a roadmap for planning, strategic decision making, as a reason to prepare a pre-feasibility study, and as a basis for raising capital and advancing its project. Now, the definition of a PEA, that is a defined term in NI 43-101. It's a study other than a pre-feasibility or feasibility study that includes an economic analysis of the potential viability of mineral resources. And there are a couple of things that follow from that. One is that it follows that it must be based on a current resource estimate, not on historical resources calculated by somebody else, not on an exploration target, not on your hopes, not on your dreams, not on pie in the sky. Another thing that follows is that it is not a pre-feasibility or feasibility study, so it has not been done to that level of accuracy, and it's insufficient to define a mineral reserve. And that in fact is in the CIM standards, that nothing is a mineral reserve until it's been defined by at least a pre-feasibility study. The companion policy to 43-101 provides guidance on PEAs. They are what other people in other jurisdictions call a scoping study or conceptual study. They can be based on measured, indicated, or inferred resources or any combination, but they shouldn't include anything else. And the disclosure of the results of the PEA could be forecast production rates, capital costs, operating costs, projected cash flows, projected mine life. And if those kinds of things get disclosed, that may trigger a technical report. In other words, if you are telling the world that you expect a certain cash flow out of a mineral discovery, you need that study to back up that claim, and you need to be able to file it as a technical report. So the distinctions between preliminary economic assessments on the one hand and pre-feasibility and feasibility studies on the other, each type of study generally assesses the same geological, engineering, and economic factors, but as you progress through pre-feasibility and feasibility studies, that's going to be done with much more detail and much more precision, and it's going to narrow down the options for production as well. There's a very significant difference, that's shown by the red line in the diagram. PEAs assess the potential viability of mineral resources. Preliminary feasibility studies and feasibility studies demonstrate the viability of mineral resources, and they establish mineral reserves. The economic distinction between a resource and a reserve, that it actually can be mined profitably, is the kind of thing you need a pre-feasibility study to determine. So a PEA, you're generally looking at cost accuracies in the neighborhood of plus or minus 30 to 50%. Generally, it's bare bones engineering, perhaps 5% of the total engineering on a project. And the mineral estimate input is the same as the mineral estimate output. You put in mineral resources, and what you get out are still mineral resources. They're not mineral reserves. So because we want people reading your disclosure to understand what a preliminary economic assessment really does mean and what it does and doesn't do, we want to see disclosure around the results of a preliminary economic assessment that have the kind of cautionary language that tell the street that this is something very preliminary, this is a thumbs up, this is not definitive. So the requirements there are in section 2.3 sub 3 43101, and basically they say that you have to tell the world that the preliminary economic assessment is preliminary in nature, that it includes inferred resources, and that those resources are too speculative geologically to have economic considerations applied to them yet. You are applying economic considerations, yes, but the street is to recognize that this is quite speculative. And the last thing is that there is no certainty that the PEA will be realized. And I mean, the plain language of that is that PEA cannot demonstrate project feasibility. You need a pre-feasibility study or a feasibility study to do that. And that the inferred resources that went into it, they may not be continuous as assumed, their grade may not be continuous as assumed, mining may not even be physically possible, the mineral in them may not be recoverable in a plant, and that the revenue and cost projections may not be accurate enough to really base any kind of economic decision on it. The other pieces of disclosure that are needed when you disclose the results of the PEA, you need to state the basis and the assumptions, not merely what metal prices you use, but how you got your cost estimates, that kind of thing. And if the preliminary economic assessment is being done after a previous pre-feasibility or feasibility study, you want to say what the impact is of that PEA on the reserves from the earlier study. If you have reserves and your PEA is on new and different material, and you just want to get an idea of what a mine expansion would look like, then it doesn't affect your reserves, and you need to disclose that along with the results of the PEA. If, on the other hand, you're doing this PEA because the economic rug has been pulled out from under your existing mineral reserve, that you may not have that mineral reserve any longer, you need to back off the reserve and actually retract the results of the earlier study and say this is our new project going forward, and here is its PEA. Some of the disclosure pitfalls that we see, simply missing out on the cautionary language, providing only pre-tax or undiscounted economic outcomes and cash flows. Everybody pays taxes and nobody has a zero cost of capital. So pre-tax PEA results and undiscounted PEA economic analyses are always misleading. Using terms like ore or mineable, that implies that reserves have demonstrated that there are reserves there and they have demonstrated economic feasibility. And as we've discussed, really a PEA cannot do that. Another question is, have you done a very accurate study and then simply called it a PEA because you don't want to finally declare reserves and trigger another independent technical report on your new reserve? If a study is done at a pre-feasibility or feasibility level of accuracy, then you shouldn't be calling it a PEA. And if the PEA has been done after a PFS, then you do need to discuss the impact that it's had on your reserves. You can't simply let that earlier study hang out there without saying how the PEA affects it. Then once you get to mineral reserve estimates, that is another period or another milestone where reports get triggered. And what happens then is that you run into the CIM definition of mineral reserve as the economically mineable part of a measured or indicated mineral resource after taking account of all relevant modifying factors. And the modifying factors are anything economic, technical, governmental, legal that may affect your ability to actually mine this at a profit. A couple of key concepts to note. One, that it's the economically mineable part of measured and indicated resources. That means you cannot convert inferred into a reserve. You have to have measured and indicated resources as a basis for your mineral reserve. And it's defined by a pre-feasibility level study or better that demonstrates that mining is justified after taking into account all relevant modifying factors. In other words, this thing is profitable. Now, a reserve estimate should include dilution, and it should include allowances for mining losses. So the reserve is generally defined as the tonnage of material that actually gets to the crusher. So mine losses and mine dilution should be included in that reserve tonnage. Anything else to put in there? Yeah, and the modifying factors, of course, are not simply the economics, but questions of permitting, questions of land title, and questions of simple access. If you can't get near it to mine it, then it's not going to be economically viable either. Now, other places have Prince Albert in a can. We have Vince McKelvey in a box. This is the famous McKelvey box with the difference between mineral resources and mineral reserves. You can see the relationship here. The concept is that you drill your way from an inferred resource to a measured resource by gathering an increased level of geological knowledge and confidence. So down that blue arrow on the left-hand side, you go from inferred to indicated and measured resources as your drilling gets tighter. But you don't drill your way to a mineral reserve. That red arrow going across is the application of the modifying factors, as the definition says. So it's the technical and economic studies that go towards showing how much of that mineral resource is actually a reserve, how much of it can actually be mined profitably. So a mineral reserve is determined after all the modifying factors to the indicated and measured resources through completing a pre-feasibility study or something equally or more rigorous. So a feasibility study obviously can also define reserves, and a life of mine plan at an operating mine does the same thing. The modifying factors, the CIM lists them as mining, processing, metallurgical, infrastructure, economic, marketing, legal, environmental, social, and governmental factors. So everything including the kitchen sink, plus all the plumbing in the plant. And in disclosing a mineral reserve, there are requirements set out in sections 2.2 and 3.4 of the rule. There's similar requirements to disclosing the resources. There's one main difference. You need to state whether reserves are included or excluded from the mineral resource. A lot of technical reports that I see, as a matter of fact, I once went through a succession of 4 or 5 continuous disclosure reviews where everybody made the same mistake. The assumption seems to be made that the resource is always inclusive of the reserves, where in fact CIM recommends against that, and a lot of the other codes recommend against it as well. You don't want people double counting, so always state whether the reserves are part of the mineral resource or whether your mineral resource is in addition to the mineral reserve. Some of the other disclosure pitfalls we see, that no cutoff grade's been reported, or nobody has said how it was determined, so you need to put the key assumptions, the price and cost assumptions and recovery assumptions surrounding the cutoff grade of the mineral reserve. The effective date is sometimes missing, and the effective date, particularly at a producing mine, once you're at that stage, you want to make sure that people know how up to date your mineral reserve estimate is. Once production and depletion has started going, people need to know how old that number is. Not using a preliminary feasibility study to establish reserves. That's a little bit more rare. Sometimes people dance around the idea of a preliminary feasibility study simply because they don't want to establish reserves. But if you say you've got a reserve, or if you say you've got ore, or if you say you've got demonstrated economic feasibility, then you really need a preliminary feasibility study at least to demonstrate that. And once you get into production, there's no technical report triggered to support a production decision, but the additional risks in that need to be disclosed so that investors are not misled. The companion policy at section 4.2 sub 6 has a little bit on that. And basically the reason that went into the companion policy was that we were seeing quite a few instances of companies putting projects into production without doing a mineral reserve estimate. It would be wrong to say that they were simply doing it to get around the technical report requirements, because sometimes there are definite management reasons for going into production when you can. But what that also means is that there's increased risk once you do start putting shovels in the ground, that there's going to be a bunch of capital lost if things don't turn out the way you planned. So we do say that if a project is in production, that the annual information form requires disclosure of information about the company as at the issuer's financial year end. For companies with material mineral projects, that's also their mineral resource and reserve estimates. So those mineral resource and reserve estimates should be the estimates as at the issuer's financial year end. So for projects in production, there should be an annual update of resource and reserve estimates in the annual information form. If they're outdated, that's not compliant with the continuous disclosure rule, NI 51-102. And good disclosure should also include reconciliation to the previous year's estimates, reflecting production, additions to reserve, and the revisions. And one thing to bear in mind is that this is not going to force you to file a new technical report and go and hire your consultants again. Annual estimates from a producing mine do not generally trigger a new technical report. And that's also in the companion policy, section 4.2 sub 10. Once you've got a mine plan and you've told the world what it is, then depletion according to that mine plan and non-material increases to the reserve, basically from drilling off other resources, those are not going to trigger a new technical report. And again, in the AIF, if you have a project that's not in production, you're not fighting this depletion and resource conversion issue as long as you disclose the most recent resource and reserve estimates with their effective date. You're fine. There have been some changes to the AIF form that applies to companies with material mineral projects. There was a revision to item 5.4 of Form F2, the AIF form, for companies with mineral projects, and that was done to reflect the changes that were made to the technical report form in 43-101 in the 2011 revisions. So going forward, AIF disclosures for issuers with mineral projects will follow more or less the revised form. And the red items there are the new requirements, and the green ones are somewhat modified requirements. For example, we telescope sampling analysis and data verification together, and we added on things like mineral processing, metallurgical testing, the processing and recovery operations, the additional infrastructure compliance, compliance activities that are going on at the project, and summary of the capital and operating costs. Then there are investor presentations and websites. You might ask why we're concerned about them. Well, the investor presentation, the roadshows, and other forms of investor relations materials, they're very often used by companies to help tell their story to investors. So investors are making decisions based on those things. And a company's website can be a key source of information for investors. Pricewaterhouse in 2013 did a study on investor presentations, or on the sources of information that investment professionals use. Investor presentations are one of the three main sources they pick up on after the annual reports and financial statements. And unlike other industries, information in investor presentations and websites overall is captured by the definition of written disclosure in NI 43-101. So disclosure rules in 43-101 don't just apply to filings, they apply to website disclosure and any other disclosure that goes out to investors in permanent form. So in a collaborative effort by Ontario, BC, and Quebec securities regulators, we reviewed 130 investor presentations. We did 50, so did BC, and Quebec did 30. The review focused on four areas. Do these website presentations comply with NI 43-101? Do they adequately disclose forward-looking information, and have they complied with 51-102 in disclosing it? Is the information balanced, and are people simply using their websites to hype via overly promotional wording? In those studies, or in those reviews, 78% of the issuers were real juniors. They were either on the TSXV or the Canadian Securities Exchange. 22% of them were on the TSX. Most were at either a pre-resource or resource stage, but 26 had progressed to a PEA, and 17 had gone all the way to a mineral reserve. And what did we find? There were 5 areas with significant non-compliance. Now, where we have the percentages there, that's the instance of non-compliance in the subset of issuers where something like this was disclosed. So, of the issuers that did disclose an exploration target, 79% got it wrong somehow. Of those that disclosed a historical estimate, 60% got it wrong somehow. Of those that put out a presentation at all, 50% did not name the QP. Of those that disclosed a preliminary economic assessment, 56% had some missing information. And of those that disclosed mineral resources or mineral reserves, half of them got something wrong. What we did find, interestingly enough, was that if the 42% of presentations that named the qualified person, there was a significant improvement in overall compliance compared to those that didn't. And the inference we made from that was that if they named the QP, then there was probably a QP that was actually reading it. So the things that we saw were that in exploration targets there was a failure to express the target as a range of tons and grade. Sometimes people would simply say that they were looking for a 2 million ounce gold deposit, or that the exploration target disclosure missed cautionary language. Historical estimate, again, missing cautionary language, but also a lack of information about the source and date of the estimate. In the case of PEAs, a lot of people doing pre-tax PEAs that we went back and got them to fix, or missing cautionary language, particularly about the use of inferred resources. And those that disclose mineral resource and mineral reserves, failure to provide the assumptions and an understanding of why the cutoff grades were chosen, and in instances where there were mineral reserves disclosed, a failure to make it clear whether those mineral reserves were part of the mineral resource or in addition to it. So the common pitfalls in technical reports, you should understand that we don't pre-clear or approve technical reports before they're filed on CDAR. When somebody puts them on CDAR, that's their work. So it's up to the company to choose the right QPs, to prepare that technical report, and then file that technical report within the time that is required to be filed. So generally, if these things are filed as a result of the disclosure of a mineral resource or mineral reserve, you've got 45 days after you news release that resource to get your technical report in. So the 5 W's, who, well, prepared by QPs. Those QPs may or may not have to be independent of the issuer and independent of the mineral property. What is it? It's a current summary of material technical information on a material property. So that a couple of things follow from that. One is that if a property is not material, it doesn't need a technical report. The other thing is that a technical report is simply a summary. It's not it's not a 51-volume feasibility study. It is meant to be something that can be read and digested by somebody that doesn't have a whole lot of time on their hands. When? It's triggered by milestone events, and it's filed within a specific time frame from those milestone events. Now, sometimes those milestone events are things like prospectus filings, and you have to have it in at the same time. Sometimes those milestone events are they're marked by first disclosure, generally through a news release. Then you've got 45 days to get your report out. Where are they? They're on CDAR. They're filed publicly there. Why do we have them? Because they're needed to support an issuer's technical disclosure and insist the decisions made by investors. How do you do them? You follow the prescribed form, which is 43101F1, and the requirements of the rule. This is a good demonstration of what's happened to the mining industry over the last 4 years. The blue bars there represent the number of technical reports that have been filed across Canada since 2007. And then the red line is the average metal price index for 8 minerals. That's gold, silver, copper, nickel, cobalt, platinum, molybdenum, and zinc. As prices have gone down, the number of filings have too. Who knew? Between 2011 and 2016, there were 68% fewer technical reports filed. It's a bit of a lagging indicator because technical reports are basically triggered by companies that are advancing their projects. So if they've got some money, they'll move projects forward, and then they'll wind up filing technical reports later as that information gets digested. We think, with a bit of an upturn in metal prices, we may start to see those blue bars grow a little bit. And the wolf in cheap clothing there is to remind you that there's a very wide range of the quality of technical reports. Not all of them are created equal. It comes down to the integrity, honesty, competence, and experience of the QPs preparing the technical report. So there's some folk wisdom out there. I have a less polite name for it, but we'll call it folk wisdom for the moment. Misconceptions about technical reports. If they're filed on CDAR, it doesn't mean we've even looked at them. They're filed by the company, and there's no vetting process ahead of time. There's a thought, particularly among investors, that the 43101 report is somehow a good housekeeping seal. It's not necessarily so. It's simply a report that actually tells you what's there and what's not. A technical report over 500 pages long must be an advanced property close to being in production. Well, no, some people had their technical reports out with a lot of things, huge drill logs, all their assay certificates, things like that. That's generally not necessary to do. And then how could the project fail? It had a 43101 technical report. Our colleagues out in BC had that experience at a CIM conference where they were being where they were being asked why a particular project in northwestern Ontario had failed when 43101 was supposed to be in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Well, 43101 is not there to prevent business failures. It's there to give investors some kind of disclosure to hang their hat on about mineral projects. So it sets standards for disclosure of technical information, but it's the QP that's responsible for the practices, methods, assumptions, and judgments used to interpret that technical information. And it is also the responsibility of the company and its management to move its projects forward in a way that limit risk to the investor. If they're not doing that, then that's not the fault of the regulations. That's because that's simply bad management of the company. So generally, two situations come up where we conduct compliance reviews of technical reports. One is via prospectus offering. If someone comes in with a prospectus for financing, we will always look at what kind of disclosure they have out there to support the prospectus. The other thing is continuous disclosure reviews. That can be full reviews undertaken simply because it's a company's turn, or it can be reviews that are based on either issues that we see going on in the market, or particular issues that are raised by complaints or by risk analysis. And based on those reviews, we may require technical reports to be amended and refiled. If we do that, we invariably have the company issue a news release that explains the reason for the refiling. So this diagram is a very simplistic representation of the process that occurs from making initial disclosure of scientific and technical information about a mineral project to ultimately ending up with a technical report that gets filed on CDAR. First off, there's the triggering disclosures. So perhaps it's a mineral resource or mineral reserve that's been disclosed for the first time in a news release. The other things it might be are an annual information form. That is necessarily a technical report trigger if a company files an annual information form and it discloses information as it is supposed to about material mineral projects in that annual information form, then that AIF itself triggers a technical report. Offering documents, invariably a company that comes in with financing via a prospectus or via a short form offering document or formerly rights offering, those kinds of documents generally trigger technical reports if they contain scientific and technical information. The website disclosure, presentations, social media, they can trigger a technical report if your idea is to disclose your new mineral resource estimate or your new preliminary economic assessment for the first time over your YouTube channel or your Facebook page. Yes, it's still caught. It still requires you to file a technical report. So if these documents listed on the left include disclosure that can trigger a technical report, then indeed you are going to have to file a technical report, and that must be publicly filed within the prescribed time frames. So 45 days for routine disclosure, or with the filing if it's something like an offering document or an AIF. And the milestones that trigger the technical reports really fall into two buckets. There are the successes or revisions on properties. So first time disclosure of a resource, a preliminary economic assessment, or a mineral reserve, or material change to any of those from what went before. So those are what we call the success or revision triggers. Generally, those will come out initially as news releases, and they'll have a 45-day window to get a technical report out. In the second instance, you have the company milestones, the event triggers. Those are the ones where a particular filing is made, or a company comes into the Canadian market. So first time reporting in Canada, filing a prospectus, filing an info circ or proxy circular that has scientific and technical information in it, takeover bid circulars, any kind of valuation in the context of a bid, the annual information form. These are the event triggers. And generally in those cases, a technical report has to be filed at the same time. There is for a director's circular, for example, a requirement to file it to give investors enough time to make a decision on the bid that the director's circular is recommending or not recommending. So they need to come out 3 days before the bid expires. Now, if there are multiple deposits on a mineral property, can an issuer file separate technical reports for those? Generally, no. Generally, no. The determining factor is whether those deposits are likely to be developed using common infrastructure, things like a central mill, and there should only ever be one current technical report on a mineral property. So if you have zones A, B, and C, and you discover zone D, you don't file a technical report on zone D alone. Similarly, they have to be continuous in time, so the stage of development doesn't mean that you file a new technical report that reflects only the metallurgical testing and economic analysis that you've just done on an older mineral resource. You can't simply rely on the old technical report for that. And the reason for that is that we don't want people having to look through 3 or 4 different technical reports to get all the information they need. They should be able to go to a single one. Independence. There are reports where the QPs signing off on the technical report must be independent, and when you need independent QPs, you need all of them to be independent. The exemption from that for producing issuers, if an issuer is large enough, it's presumed that first of all they've probably got the expertise to do their own reports. And second of all, they're actually in production, so you're not really worried about a vanishing resource. And some tips for preparing them. Make sure you have sufficient relevant experience. Know what the technical report is being used for and what was the triggering event. So if it's for a mineral resource estimate, then that's what the technical report has to be written about. Set up a basic template and use a checklist based on the disclosure requirements. Remember the definition standards and use the up-to-date ones. The most recent are from 2014. Follow the best practice guidelines. Look at our staff notices because there is useful guidance in there. Write a concise and complete summary of the significant findings, and if you want a good template for a summary, go and look at the item 5.4 of the annual information form. That can then be cut and pasted into annual information forms, prospectuses, or whatever, and the QP knows that it's his words and not someone else's. Clearly state potential risks and uncertainties of the project and get someone to look at it. Have it peer reviewed. That's probably easier to do in large consulting firms than it is for sole proprietors, but sole practitioners with a buddy system, that can happen. Some general observations about the usual pitfalls. Most of these things are not fraud. There are a few people that don't understand the rules. There are fewer that don't follow them, and there are a few that don't use industry best practices, guys that have just always done it that way. And one of the best ways to improve that kind of compliance is to have another pair of eyes on the report. The form was revised in 2011, and the 9 items that are there in bold are often the areas where we see common non-compliance issues. The summary, need a brief summary of the key findings, but it should have all the major findings of the technical report. The introduction, introducing the objectives and scope of the report and the reason that it's being filed, and identifying QPs that are involved and their responsibilities and who among them did the site visit is always really valuable in item 2. Reliance on other experts, that should be for non-technical information. It's reasonable to rely on other experts, but make that reliance explicit in item 3. Say who you're relying on, why you're relying on them, and exactly what information you're relying on. Data verification, often the worst thing I see in technical reports. It needs to reflect and support the findings of the technical report. So describe the data verification, the QP's opinion on the adequacy and reliability of the data, and actually show some QA/QC type work in the verification section. In the mineral resource estimate, it's the foundation of any mineral project, so summarize the key assumptions and parameters and methods around it. Things like the cutoff grade, the metal price, and the recovery. Item 20, environmental or social issues. This is one of the new sections, and because social license and local approval is critical for any project to move forward, you need to identify what's been done about that. Identify the permitting activities, the environmental studies that have been completed, and what are the requirements to do this project right? How are you going to dispose of tailings? How are you going to manage water? How are you going to close the project at the end? Capital and operating cost. Sometimes it's one big number, sometimes it's one big spreadsheet, and the most useful thing is somewhere in between. So a simple table showing the major cost centers, how much they are going to cost, and what the basis is for the cost estimates. The economic analysis, its assumptions should be reasonable and defensible. You need to consider taxes, and there needs to be a sensitivity analysis over a reasonable range. The idea of looking at a 5% decline in the price and a 30% increase, it's potentially misleading, and it's also going to limit the usefulness of your report, because if you have a wider sensitivity analysis in the report, then your economic analysis is going to be more robust. It's going to still be usable in those times when metal prices decline or go way up. And the interpretations and conclusions, important to state the significant risks and uncertainties and all of the things that may reasonably affect the reliability or confidence, particularly in the resource and reserve estimates. So if you look at the regulations, the companion policies, and the staff notices, look at CIM standards and CIM best practices, you come out with compliance. And I will now turn it over to Ray to talk about the MD&A review.
Thanks, Jim. We also want to spend some time today to address some of the common areas of weaknesses that we see in MD&As filed by small and medium enterprises, and tell you how we are trying to help venture issuers streamline interim MD&As. I'll start by reviewing our observations on MD&As from OSC Staff Notice 51-722. Management discussion and analysis should be meaningful, or else what's the point of preparing one? As preparers and advisors, you can help add value to readers of the MD&A by ensuring that the MD&A complements the financial statements, provides balanced reporting, and is updated for new events. The MD&A should complement financial statements by providing insights into the financial information rather than just repeating numbers from the financial statements. It should explain changes, lack of expected changes, and the company's progress towards milestones. The MD&A can provide balanced reporting by addressing the bad news as well as the good. Management earns credibility in the eyes of investors when it acknowledges things that have gone wrong and demonstrates a plan to rectify or respond to that plan. The MD&A should also be updated for new events. If you're to take MD&As for 2 periods side by side, it should be clear that there are changes other than the date at the top. It should be clear what progress has been made in the period covered by the MD&A. To form the observations in the staff notice, we reviewed a sample of 100 Ontario mining issuers with a market capitalization less than $100 million and focused on compliance with the MD&A requirements and venture issuer disclosure requirements. The sample was almost equally comprised of venture and non-venture issuers and had a broad spectrum of mining companies at various development stages. Some issuers have a hard time with the discussion of operations section in the MD&A when they don't have revenue. There may be a misconception that discussion of operations only applies to items like revenues or cost of sales. However, securities law prescribes disclosure of some specific items to help investors further understand a company's operations and situations when discussion of revenues are not significant, such as a company that is still in the development stage. Section 1.4 of the MD&A form prescribes disclosure for investors that have significant projects that have not yet generated revenue. The form requires a description of the project, a discussion of the company's plan for the project, and status against originally projected plans. We often find the initial discussion is not updated to show the company's progress against their initial plan. To be meaningful to investors, project updates should discuss the status of the plan, expenditures made in the current period, the expenditures to date, and anticipated time and cost to reach the next phase or milestone. This information is helpful for investors to understand the progress that an issuer has made on a project during the current period and to understand where the company is headed. This slide identifies some hot buttons to keep in mind when preparing disclosure for projects not yet generating revenue. Overall, you're required to describe the project and talk about the status and expenditures relative to the big picture on a property-by-property or a project-by-project basis. When describing a project, issuers do not need to repeat the history of a project in every MD&A. We noted many instances where issuers were merely repeating the information previously disclosed in an earlier MD&A without including information about the current period. While issuers without a current AIF may want to include more historical information to provide background information about their projects, the majority of the discussion should focus on what happened in the current year or interim period. The disclosure of the status of the project should consider the issuer's progress compared to the plan, the next steps, and the expected timing. The disclosure of the expenditure should reflect on where issuers have spent money. This is an opportunity for management to help investors understand how the issuer has spent money. Good disclosure here can help the MD&A complement the financial statements, so it's important to investors to explain where the funds were directed, whether it's for looking for new materials, conducting field tests, running clinical trials, drilling, or analysis. The disclosure should also describe the necessary steps to advance the project to the next level and how it will be financed. Investors need to understand where the project is headed, so the disclosure of a project status and expenditures should be tied back to the anticipated timing and cost to take the project to the next stage of the plan. I would caution you about being overly optimistic about timing and results, as investors, analysts, and regulators will expect incremental disclosure as time passes. The absence of appropriate updates may be a signal that the disclosures are misleading and may lead into complaints from investors, decrease credibility with analysts, and attract regulatory scrutiny. Another area where we see that disclosure could be improved is around liquidity and capital resources. We often find generic discussion of current cash balances and current working capital balances. A good analysis of liquidity involves a meaningful discussion of cash flows from operations, investing, and financing beyond stating balances from the financial statements. Rather than repeating items that are reported in the statement of cash flows, a company should concentrate on disclosing the primary drivers of cash flows and the reasons for material changes in major sub-items underlining the line items reported in the financial statements. Companies should also consider whether they need to provide enhanced disclosures about significant debt instruments, guarantees, and covenants. This disclosure is important so that investors can understand any anticipated funding shortfalls and financing resources available to meet spending commitments and continue key projects. It's important to focus on realistic solutions and providing an analysis that will let investors know how you'll carry on your business. In addition, companies should disclose significant developments in liquidity or capital resources that occur after the balance sheet date. The next two slides identify some hot buttons to keep in mind when preparing disclosure on liquidity and capital resources. The general areas are the company's ability to generate cash, its working capital requirements, its spending requirements, and sources of financing. For your ability to generate cash, are you able to generate sales, collect receivables? When do you expect sales or licensing or royalties? For your working capital requirements, do you have a deficiency? If so, how do you plan to address it? For your spending requirements, do you have payments coming up for capital expenditures, inventory, or milestone payments? What payments are necessary to keep your properties or licenses in good standing? For your sources of financing, have you obtained it? What sources are being pursued? The disclosure should explain why management believes it has sufficient resources. Issuers can provide this discussion of working capital requirements by better explaining and quantifying their working capital needs and how their working capital needs relate to their plan for the next fiscal year or up to the next business milestone. Having working capital in excess of last year's expenditures is not sufficient for investors to understand why the issuer has sufficient financial resources if the plan or outlook isn't also disclosed. Clear entity-specific disclosure is important so that investors can understand any anticipated funding shortfalls and financing resources available to meet spending commitments and continue key projects. Disclosure is helpful even when exploration has been on hold. A complete discussion of the issuer's financial obligations and discretionary expenses helps an investor better understand how an issuer is meeting its obligations during a time when exploration is on hold. This is an opportunity for an issuer to explain to investors how it is controlling its costs, the minimum amount of funds it needs to get through the next period, and how the issuer expects to finance it. It is also important that the discussion in the liquidity section ties to the operating plan. In our review, we noted instances where there was disclosure of a plan to spend significant amounts to develop property. In some of these instances, the liquidity section only discussed current working capital requirements, which was inconsistent with the discussion of operations in the plans to develop the property. The liquidity section should also be a complete discussion, including cash requirements for both operating and capital requirements planned for the upcoming year. The next area is venture issuer disclosures. For a venture issuer that has not had significant revenues in the past few years, there are additional disclosure requirements that are incremental to the disclosure required in the discussion of operations for projects not yet generating revenues that I discussed earlier. This disclosure is also relevant and meaningful for smaller non-revenue generating non-venture issuers. This slide lists some of the specific items that venture issuers without significant revenue must break down. The specific list of items can be found in Section 5.3 of 51-102. Another takeaway from the slide is that if the venture issuer's business is primarily involved in mining, exploration, and development, this analysis must be presented on a property-by-property basis. Finally, this information may be disclosed either in the financial statements or in the MD&A. So we often find that venture issuers don't provide a detailed breakdown of material costs and expenditures on a property-by-property basis. And given that there's no revenue-generating activity, this is the sort of information that investors are interested in. A detailed breakdown helps investors understand where the issuer expended its resources. Providing a breakdown of the material components of exploration and evaluation, a presentation of E&E assets or expenditures on a property-by-property basis, general administrative expenses, and other material costs incurred, help investors understand the nature of the work being performed, how money is being spent, and helps them evaluate the impact the expenses have in moving the exploration or developments of properties moving forward. This slide identifies some hot buttons to keep in mind when preparing required venture issuer disclosures. The key areas on the slide are that the allocation of the expenditures should be disaggregated appropriately in line with our companion policy. In our view, we consider a material component of cost to be something that is greater than 20% of the total amount of the class and $25,000. We also think that the breakdown should be provided on a property-by-property basis, and it should also be accompanied by qualitative disclosure explaining changes and lack of expected changes. OSC Staff Notice 51-722 also touches on two other areas that I want to highlight today, which are related party transactions and risk factors. We are aware that many smaller issuers leverage their business relationships to advance their projects in a cost-controlled fashion by entering into related party contracts or transactions. It is critical that issuers are transparent to their shareholders about these transactions in the MD&A so investors can better understand the business purpose and value of these transactions. Many issuers do not appropriately disclose the entity of the related party involved in the transaction. Most commonly, the relationship is disclosed, but the actual party involved in the transaction is not named. We also find that risk factors is another area that can be improved. Company risk can impact investors' investment decisions, so it is important that issuers provide specifics about the risks impacting an issuer's business. Where possible, issuers should quantify the risks, and when listing or ranking potential risks, be clear about their severity and significance. To make the information more meaningful, issuers should update their risk disclosures when circumstances change. We noted that issuers often conclude an individual risk discussion by saying if the risk was realized, it could have a material adverse impact on the company without stating specifically what that might be. The disclosure doesn't specifically indicate whether it would affect revenues, cash flows, or costs, Would the impact potentially be isolated such that it could be managed swiftly, or would it have a sweeping pervasive effect that could endanger the company's solvency or viability, or would its effect lie somewhere in between? And for how long can the issuer rely on existing sources of liquidity before additional financing is needed? Risk disclosure needs to be specific. Knowing that an issuer faces normal risks inherent to the mining industry does not inform investors of the issuer's specific operations. So far today, I've identified a number of areas where issuers can improve their MD&A disclosure. I also wanted to tell you how we are trying to help issuers streamline their disclosure. So in June 2015, there are a number of amendments to 51-102, 41-101, and 52-110. The substance and purpose of the changes is to focus the disclosure of venture issuers on information that reflects the needs and expectation of venture issuer investors and modify disclosure obligations that may be less valuable to those investors. For the purpose of today's discussion, I will focus on the additional options to venture issuers for MD&A disclosure. For further information about venture issuer regulation, you can download a presentation on venture issuer regulation on our website. Under the amendments, venture issuers have the option to fulfill the interim MD&A requirements by preparing and filing a streamlined disclosure document referred to as quarterly highlights. This would only apply in each of the first 3 quarters, so in your Q1, Q2, or Q3. It's important to note that this is an optional form. Venture issuers could alternatively choose to comply with the full interim MD&A requirement. The quarterly highlights is a short discussion of all material information about your company's operations, liquidity, and capital resources. If a venture issuer chooses to file the quarterly highlights, there's no change for CDR filing purposes. The quarterly highlights is filed as an MD&A, and the document must be titled Interim MD&A Quarterly Highlights. There are also no changes to CEO and CFO certifications. So, whether preparing a full MD&A or quarterly highlights, issuers should avoid boilerplate disclosure where the MD&A merely repeats the information from the financial statements. You should be telling the story to investors, don't just repeat the numbers. As opposed to the full interim MD&A, which requires updating of each item discussed in annual MD&A, for the quarterly highlights, provide a short, focused discussion that gives a balanced and accurate picture of the company's business activities during the interim period. The purpose of the quarterly highlights reporting is to provide a brief narrative update about the business activities, financial condition, financial performance, and cash flow of the company. While summaries are to be clear and concise, they are subject to the normal prohibitions against false and misleading statements. As I mentioned earlier, the Form QH for quarterly highlights is optional, and as such, venture issuers should take the needs of their investors into consideration when determining whether to provide quarterly highlights or full interim MD&A. I have no doubt that for smaller venture issuers, quarterly highlights will provide useful information and will likely satisfy the needs of investors and smaller venture issuers. However, for larger venture issuers, or venture issuers with revenue from operations, it is probably more difficult to describe what happened in the quarter without discussing in details variances in revenues or variances in expenses, for examples. I think it would be difficult to tell the story, so to speak, if using the quarterly highlights form instead of the full interim MD&A. Also, investors in larger venture issuers, including those with significant revenue, may want full interim MD&A to assist them in making informed investment decisions. If your company is a venture issuer without significant revenue from operations, focus your discussion and analysis of financial performance on expenditures and progress towards achieving your business objectives and milestones. So, as I mentioned, a venture issuer that provides quarterly highlights is not required to update its annual MD&A in the quarterly highlights. However, to meet the requirements of Section 2.2.1 of Form 51-102-F1, the venture issuer should disclose in its quarterly highlights any change, if material, from plans disclosed in the annual MD&A. For example, if a mining issuer discloses a drill program in its annual MD&A and decides to make a change to that drill program in a subsequent interim period, that change, if material, should be disclosed in the quarterly highlights for that period. So I hope today I've been able to give you a brief overview of the MD&A and some areas for improvement, and give you some background on how we're trying to streamline the process for disclosing, complying with the MD&A disclosure for venture issuers. So I think at this point we're ready to So Thank you very much for your time today. And our contact information is here in the presentation. If you have any additional questions for Craig, Jim, or myself, feel free to contact us. And thank you very much for your time today.